Hello and welcome to your Scouting Basics tutorial. Today we're going to talk about how we build our scouting reports and the information that we look at in order to form our game plans for our teams. What are we looking at when we start scouting? Every team has weaknesses, different strengths that we want to identify in order to formulate our game plans. The weaknesses we want to make sure that we can try and exploit to give ourselves an advantage as we play them in competition. There are 6 main topics that we really look at when we're looking to do some scouting. The first is, where do we serve? Number 2 is, what do the opponents, hitters, like to do when they attack? Third, what is their offensive system? What is their blocking and defensive system? What kind of serving do they have and what are their strategies? And lastly, a little bit about what they like to do in each rotation. So going through one by one, we're going to talk about their serving first, our passing and their serving. Firstly, we want to know who their weakest passers are, if they have specific weaknesses, whether it's something like they're stronger against a float serve versus a topspin serve. Are they weaker passing a serve that's coming from zone 5 on that cross court to zone 5, or maybe they're weaker against a serve down the line? This kind of information we can use to potentially knock them out of system and give ourselves a better advantage as we go forward. There's also the idea of maybe tactically we can try and crowd certain areas of the court, serving short sometimes to try and jam a slide hitter's route, serving to get a big hitter out of their route or a D hitter out of a back row route. All these strategies are something that we want to look at when trying to formulate a game plan and build a scouting report for our opponents. Secondly, we want to look at where their hitters like to attack. We know that hitters all have certain tendencies and preferences. It doesn't mean that they're going to hit there every time, but knowing what they like to do and potentially, as we are doing some reading on the defensive side, what the situation dictates they can do, gives our defense the ability to make certain adjustments to put ourselves in a better position to dig or block the ball and transition for a kill on our own side. So using both pieces of that information of what they like to do and what the situation dictates, whether it's a set that's maybe dying inside, a hitter that's not quite getting their feet to the ball, certain situations will dictate whether or not a hitter has certain options. Thirdly, we can talk about what kind of offensive system do they like to run. Are they a fast-paced team, much like we are in the USA, where you run very quick tempo to the outsides? Do they run slower? Do they like to run the middles mostly just in front, or do they run a lot behind on the slide? Do they run combination plays? Do they like to run a slide hitter with their opposite coming around for an X2, hitting a 2-ball in the middle? Do they run combinations with the front row and the back row? And certain tendencies from their setters as well, if they like to overload or isolate, or do they like to repeat? All that information can help us formulate a game plan on the defensive side of the ball to try and build an advantage for ourselves as well. Number 4, how do they like to block and defend? Certain teams, much like ourselves in the USA, like to run a bunch read swing block system. Other teams around the country or around the world also might like to run a split block system where they have their pin blockers split out wide to the antenna and just dedicate to that outside attacker. Knowing this information can help us formulate an offensive game plan that might exploit some of those weaknesses. Knowing a little bit about each of their individual blockers on the other side of the net is also an advantage. Are they particularly weak moving laterally? Maybe a blocker is weaker moving to her left than her right. Maybe she's a little bit slower in closing down to a fast-paced go. All this information can help our setters with some decision making on where they might set in certain situations. Fifth, what kind of serving do they like to use? Are they a jump float team? Are they a jump topspin team? Do they mix it up? Do they like to serve deep short? Certain teams in the world like to serve zone 1 almost exclusively. This kind of information can help our passers anticipate a little bit more what may be coming their way, if we need to pinch in certain directions, or maybe it kind of helps us formulate an idea of what we want to run in that rotation. If a pass is coming out of zone 1, it might be easier to set a certain direction. Number 6, a little bit of what they like to do in each rotation. Teams have certain tendencies within each rotations, especially when we start to figure out, is there setter front row? Is there setter back row? When they have 3 hitters in the front row, there are different options versus when they only have 2 hitters. For instance, most teams will run the slide more often when there's only 2 hitters in the front row. Certain teams don't like to run out of the back row quite as often as others. This information also helps us formulate a defensive game plan that can give us an advantage if we can anticipate a little bit more about what's coming our way. So there are 6 main points that we are looking at when we're scouting opposing teams. And you'll see as we go through some examples of the women's national team scouting report, each of these 6 items are addressed in hopefully a fairly simple manner for us to interpret. A quick question to you all out there. In this following scenario, what might be some blocking adjustments that we can make if a team has these 3 points in their scouting report? Point number 1, in rotations 1 through 3, when their setter is in the back row, their setter really likes to isolate by using the gap and set overhead to the red. In rotations 4 through 6, when their setter's in the front row, the middle blockers always run a slide in serve-receive. And point number 3, they rarely run the back row attack, either a D or a BIC, off of a perfect pass. So get together, think about it on your own. What do you think might be some adjustments that you can make for a team like this? So some possible answers to this question could be potentially the middle blocker could stay a little bit more neutral, not fronting necessarily the opposing middle blocker, and focus more on the read aspect than anything else because the setters like to set overhead, even though they are running a gap in front in rotations 1 through 3. In addition, when the setter's in the front row, our left side blocker can mirror that slide hitter and dedicate there knowing that that's an attack that they like to run quite often. In addition to that, because of the perfect pass scenario where they don't like to run the back row and serve-receive, if that's the case, our middle blocker can eliminate certain options and our left side blocker can eliminate certain options and be really good on the hitters in their zone. One more question for you. How about some other defensive adjustments we can make for the second team that might have these 3 points in their scouting report? Point number 1, on every free ball, they like to run the slide X2 go combination in rotations 1 through 3, mostly setting the slide of the X2 and rarely setting the go. In transition, their setter really likes to set against the flow. In rotations 4 through 6, when their setter's in the front row, they like to run the slide go, but mostly, as you see, 67% of the time, like to set the go. What are some options that you might think our defense can make in game planning against a team that runs an offense like this? So some possible ideas here for our defense. Maybe plan around having to defend that X2 combination in the middle. Our left side blocker will call their hitter coming around. Our middle blocker will call the middle running that slide, and we'll have to have our eyes really good on that movement. Our middle blocker will be really good on reading that hitter coming around and anticipating that X2 being set in front of them, and our left side blocker might have to make a strong mirror move to the slide that's coming around as well. In transition, our middle blockers should really focus on resetting to neutral and being good in their base read, expecting that long distance set to go overhead because the setter really likes to set against the flow, we can't necessarily start to move with and follow that pass in the setter as it moves along the net. When our opponents are in rotations 4 through 6 and the setter's in the front row, again, our middles should be really good in being neutral in a read so they can react both to the go and to the slide. Our left side blocker can probably also, again, do a mirror move, being really good on that slide hitter. And our right side blocker can anticipate having to be really strong with their move on the go attacker because they like to set that go more often than not in those rotations. So we'll move forward now and take a quick look at our national team scouting reports. Firstly, we break this up into essentially 2 segments. The first segment we call our general tendencies page. This general tendencies page has multiple pieces of information that we would have talked about previously in our 6 points of a scouting report. Firstly, we take a look at their projected lineup. We'll try and present information to show you who we expect them to play and start in certain positions. Secondly, we'll talk about our bingo goals. This is something that Karch harps on a lot as goals that we would have for our own team to hopefully execute within each set. For instance, you'll see the B in bingo is to try and get 2 stuffs or transition kills on the opposing outside hitter's attacks. So these are options and opportunities for us to gain an advantage if we can execute upon these skills within that set. The next section is the attacker tendencies. So showing each potential attacker in their lineup and what their favorite shots are on specific attacks, whether it's a hitter that likes to hit mostly cross court when they run the go, maybe they like to hit down the line more so when they run the red. A middle attacker when they run the slide is mostly hitting cross body. All this information can be presented fairly simply, as you can see by the color coding and the directional lines on each of those charts. Additionally, underneath each of those attackers' charts, you can see that we have some defensive adjustments that we can make for our team. You'll see acronyms down there with RSB or RBD. That meaning, for instance, our right side blocker or right back defender. And these are specific adjustments outside of our normal base defense that we might make on specific attackers. Moving forward, there's also some blocker notes. We talked about wanting to know a little bit about their blocking and defensive scheme. These notes can help our setters understand what directions maybe we might want to set, or certain blockers we might want to go after because they're particularly weak at reading, for instance, an overload gap go. This information can be really valuable in that aspect and gaining that advantage if we can score 1 or 2 extra points. Additionally, we might have some notes on the opposing setters. We talked a little bit about previously in one of our quiz questions, a setter that likes to set against the flow in transition. These might be notes that talk about their hand setup. Do they tend to reach out far in front of them when they set the go and really have a big arch in their back when they set overhead? This can help our blockers and defenders make a stronger read on the opposing setter as well. The next page that we have in our scouting report is our rotations sheet. This sheet summarizes some of their general tendencies within each rotation and identifies for us maybe what our potential serving targets and zones are going to be against these specific teams when they're in those specific rotations. This again is broken up into multiple areas that have different types of information. Again, you'll see that we show our projected lineups for the opposing team and what our possible serving targets may be if they are on the floor at that time. The next is their distributions and tendencies. Distributions you'll see across the top, a quick summary of what they like to run when they are in system and serve receive, and the percentages to which they like to set in each of those zones of the net. You'll see there in rotation 1, for instance, their in-system distribution. They really like to go pin to pin, and those numbers are fairly even if you look at those numbers across the top between the right side and the left side. Additionally, you see their serve-receive pattern and the routes and general directions that their attackers like to run. and you'll see a darker shaded orange or red area. That signifies the seam or the zone or an area that we would like to attack as a serving team. And lastly, on the bottom, much like on our general tendencies page, you'll see a summary of some of our defensive adjustments for each of our defenders and blockers within each of those rotations as well. So hopefully, as we've gone through each of these pages on our scouting reports, you have a better idea of the information that we are trying to pull and understand better to gain an advantage across the other team. If you have any questions on this, feel free to reach out. And additionally, anything that you might additionally have, you can ask your coaches as well.